What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today's lecture is scheduled for April. What day is today? The 8th. April 8th, Wednesday. Yesterday, we talked about Martin Luther King and the March on Washington and the Birmingham church bombing. Today, we're going to let that take us into the Civil Rights Act of 1964, one of the most influential and important pieces of legislation in our American history. Now, in this bill is a wide umbrella of coverage of non-discriminatory acts. So, some background on this: this was handwritten originally by President John F. Kennedy. I believe he started it in 1962. He finishes it in 1963, and he tries pushing it through approval. He tries getting votes and whatnot, and there's kind of a push against it, so it doesn't get pushed immediately. And then in 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated, and it's a huge shock to the world, just shock to the American individuals. This is for that generation, an unspeakable tragedy. Kennedy was pretty popular. Like, he wasn't everybody's favorite, but he was a likable person in the White House. He was young, he was energetic, he was charismatic and respected, and he was killed in such a brutal way in front of everybody that his assassination shook the country. You can ask your grandparents or anybody old enough from around that time, and if they were 10 years old and above, they will remember when they heard that Kennedy was assassinated. It was a huge deal. It is maybe the most shocking single event of that entire century, and it made everybody uncomfortable and uneasy. And so when his vice president Lyndon Johnson stepped in, many of Kennedy's cabinet believed that there was no greater show of respect and admiration for the former president than to pass his civil rights bill. And so that was kind of the momentum that ended up getting this passed, because it was a big deal. There was a lot of pushback, especially from the South, and certain northern legislators were kind of on the fence about it. But Kennedy's tragic passing is actually kind of the nudge forward that they, I guess, needed to get this passed. So what's in the bill? Well, the Justice Department, the American Justice Department, which is a federal department, can now prosecute any individual or any company or organization that discriminates based on race, color, sex, or origin. So if someone applies for a job and you don't, or if you have a bunch of applicants for a job and it's pretty well understood that based on resumes, one individual sticks out as most impressive, and then you don't hire them because of their skin color or because of their gender, then you could be prosecuted. You or your company could face federal charges. It also outlaws segregation in public. So no more separate drinking fountains, no more separate bathrooms, or restaurants that wouldn't serve African Americans. Like they could all be tried in federal court. And these aren't like fresh ideas. These aren't things that they just thought of. But this bill was the first one that actually provided a plan for, well, what happens if someone violates the desegregation movement? And now the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says, well, now they can be prosecuted. Now they can be taken to federal court. And that was a huge deal. It further requires schools to desegregate, and it really just carries on the practices that were decided by Brown versus Board 2 and Boynton versus Virginia, the previous educational court cases. The difference here was, again, it actually provided a plan, and it provided a punishment for any school that was not going to comply. Now, this isn't perfect. The Civil Rights Act of 64 isn't extremely enforced originally. It takes some time. It takes a couple years before the Justice Department is big enough. When it was originally created, the Justice Department was not very big, and so it couldn't possibly handle all of the discrimination cases and all of the resegregation cases. Over time, they eventually get to the point to where they can handle it, and it does further push forward the movement. This bill was met with a lot of Southern pushback. Some of the Southern senators were very against it. A man by the name of Strom Thurmond, who is probably the one individual that's most closely linked to segregation in the South. Strom Thurmond was from South Carolina, and he was a big segregationist, and he said in front of the Senate that it'd be a cold day in hell before he desegregated South Carolina. And after a filibuster, which we talked about before, trying to talk down a bill, after multiple Democrats gave long individual filibusters, like as a group, the filibuster lasted through probably 4 or 5 sessions. So about 60 hours, quite a bit. But to combat a filibuster, the group that is against talking down a bill, they can vote. They can vote to end the filibuster and immediately get to a voting of the bill. But you need 2/3 to end the filibuster, which in the Senate, if you have 100 senators, which we do, we have 2 per state, we have 100 senators, so you need 67 senators to vote in favor of ending the filibuster. And that doesn't happen very often to get that number, because usually the party lines are split, and regardless of which side has a majority, whether it's Republican or Democrat, there's, I don't think, ever actually been a 67% majority of one party over the other. But in this case, some of the northern Democrats were like, okay, this is dumb. Let's vote on this thing. We're tired of listening to these segregationalists, jabber nonstop. So they ended up getting, I think, 71 votes to end the filibuster and to go ahead and pass And then they voted on the Civil Rights Bill itself, which passed, and Civil Rights Act of '64 was in effect. Now, what this doesn't do is it doesn't directly address the voting situation in the South. So they had to create an, I don't know if you call it an amendment or an add-on to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but they had to add into it some laws about voting. As before this, most African Americans in the South could not vote. Now they had the legal right to, but that right was violated numerous times. And there are many different ways in which African Americans had their right to vote stripped from them. One of them is just through intimidation. You had people standing at the voting booths, standing outside of them because you couldn't be inside of the booth, but standing outside with a gun or looking like they were about to punch you if you were African American and tried to walk in that voting booth. Or there'd be a mob and you would for sure get lynched in that case. So intimidation was an unofficial way of keeping African Americans from voting. Then there's poll taxes, which required a fee to vote. And in the South, many African Americans were sharecroppers, which they didn't make much money. In fact, they hardly made any. Like sharecropping really just provided you with your basic necessities. You worked land that someone else owned, and you provided the owner of the land with the fruits of your labor, and they allowed you to live on that land. That was kind of that's the life of a sharecropper. So they couldn't pay the poll tax. Charging people to vote. That's basically what a poll tax was, which in today's society is ridiculous. No one pays to vote. It's a basic right of each individual who's a citizen at 18. And then a grandfather clause. You didn't have to do any of these poll taxes or tests if your grandfather had the right to vote. If your grandfather had the right to vote, you were considered what they call grandfathered in, and that's where this term comes from. The term being grandfathered in is directly from the grandfather clauses of voters. Now, the impact that has is think about the age difference between you and your grandparents. Say your grandfather is 50 years older than you. So think about in 1960, you're a 30-year-old, or let's say you're a 40-year-old African American going to vote. You can't afford the poll tax, you can't pass the literacy test, and you are at the booth, and the clerk asks you if you pass the grandfather clause. And you think back to your grandfather, you are 50 or you're 40 years old in 1960. So let's just estimate your grandfather is 60 years older than you. 60 years older than you. So let's go back to when your grandfather was 30 years old. So let's say, I know this is a long thinking exercise, but okay, you're 40 in 1960. Your grandfather's 60 years older than you. He's 100 years old. So let's think back to when your grandfather was 40, which would have been in 1860. Would your grandfather have had the right to vote in 1860 if he were African American like you? No. So you are not grandfathered in. You can't skip these other steps like the white people could. So that was another obstacle. Now I skipped over literacy tests because I wanted to talk about that last. Literacy tests were just basic tests that were handed out and you were told to, pass it. There are different kinds of literacy tests and they were given by I forget what they call the person that runs the voting booths, but it's completely up to their discretion which test you get. And most places had tests that were extremely simple, like could you write your name, please? You write your name, okay, you pass the literacy test, correct. That was more than likely given to you if you were a white male. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, the test could be something near impossible or confusing or just a quiz full of trick questions that we could look at, being semi-educated as we are, and we would struggle with it. Now imagine the fact that many African Americans in the South, especially sharecroppers, they have but only the most modest and basic of education. Many of them had no more than like a 5th or 6th grade education. And now they're being told, well, if you can't pass this college level Algebra 2 test, well, then you don't get to vote. So there you see the difficulties in this system for African Americans. The system was made against African Americans, and it was meant to keep them from voting because their vote would balance out many of the white votes, which were in the South especially, given most white people down there voted for the segregationalists, the Strom Thurmonds, the Orville Faubus types. And in states like Mississippi, where a majority of the population was African American, like over 50% of the people in Mississippi are African American. Think about if a majority of the people could vote and they could vote for politicians that weren't segregationists. Imagine a state like Mississippi giving all of its African American eligible voters a voice and the changes that would have been made there. That would have been just strange. That would have been so different from how it actually was in reality. So I wanted to cut the lecture kind of short today. Maybe that wasn't actually short at all. I talked plenty, but the essential question is going to be a little different today. Now, with this lecture, I linked a website that you will go to. At the bottom, there's a short article. You don't have to read it. You can. It's not long at all. It's like two or three paragraphs. At the end of it, there's a copy of a 1964 Louisiana literacy test. Now, I don't have a way of getting you a hard copy of it, and I don't want you to have to print it off. Read through the test and mentally think of the answers. And I don't have an answer key on me. I did find an answer key to this somewhere else. So I do know the answers. But I want you to mentally go through it. If you want to write them down on paper, you can. Mentally go through, read the questions, honestly think about it. Read the directions. That's the important part. Read the directions. See, it tells you what is considered a passing test, which is insane. And then mentally go through, answer the questions, and then come back to the essential question assignment and tell me what questions or questions do you think you probably got wrong, or do you think were most confusing? That's it. And don't tell me you got it all right, because then I'll quiz you at Thursday's Zoom meeting. Don't think I won't. I want you guys to understand just how unfair the system was. And this was given in 1964. This is like right before the Civil Rights Act of 64 is passed. Like, this is a modern, this was a test that was given, let's see, let me math here, less than 60 years ago to block someone's right to vote. Less than 60 years ago. In the scope of history, that is a short amount of time. So look it over. Let me know how you think you did. And we will talk on Thursday, Zoom meeting Thursday as well as a lecture, and then we'll go into the nice long weekend. So that'll be it. Have a good one, guys. Take care.